Auschwitz-Birkenau was the most infamous and brutal concentration camp in all of Nazi Germany. Over 1 million people were killed within its walls, either in the gas chambers or shot by sadistic guards. Living conditions were horrendous, with many prisoners perishing from cold, hunger, and disease. The corpses exceeded the capacity of the crematoria that operated day and night, filling the killing center with smoke and ash. Life there was short and cruel, and only a few of those who entered were fortunate enough to be free again. Today, in this new military history video, we will show you full-color images, like you have never seen before, that reflect how brutal it was to live in the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. Poland was invaded by Germany on September 1st, 1939, thus beginning World War II. Within a month, the Nazis had swept away the defenders, and by October 6th, the entire country was under their control. Tens of thousands of soldiers were made prisoners of war, and civilians imprisoned by the Germans were also taken. These included politicians, intellectuals, journalists, artists, and many more who formed the elite of the nation's society. But now the Germans were faced with a dilemma. They needed a place to house them until they decided what to do with them. Near the town of Oswiecim, or Auschwitz in German, were barracks that had previously been used by Polish forces. There, the Nazis found the perfect place to establish the infamous concentration camp where millions of people would be murdered. It was in a sparsely populated area, but at the intersection of railroad tracks, which would facilitate the transportation of people. The first center built was called Auschwitz-I, which had 22 one- or two-story buildings inside. Initially, about 700 Polish prisoners were sent there. But as the months passed, as the Nazis increased their conquests across Europe, more and more men and women were transferred. The camp was overwhelmed, so the German guards put the new arrivals to work. The number of buildings was expanded, and in those that only had one floor, an additional floor was added. The working conditions were brutal, with little food and almost no time for rest. The German guards, all members of the cruel SS, frequently tortured the weakest, making them work until they fell exhausted. Although the camp had not yet been converted into an extermination center, they did not care if their captives died. On June 22, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and within a few months, they conquered hundreds of kilometers of territory, along with all the people who lived there.
Hitler, he saw world Jewry as a threat to the German race. Right? Hitler's thinking about this in terms of biology. He also sees communism as a threat to Western civilization. And from Hitler's perspective, and many of those in the Nazi leadership, Jews were behind the Soviet threat. The Jew equaled a Bolshevik, so he was able to destroy the Soviet Union. He could kill two birds with one stone.
Due to the invasion, the Nazis again had thousands of prisoners to be imprisoned, and many of them were sent to Auschwitz. The population of 700 had, in just 1 year, grown to approximately 11,000. Not only were there Poles now, but also Jews, Slavs, Roma, communists, and many others, branded by the Nazis as inferior and subhuman. In October 1941, construction began on Auschwitz II, better known as Birkenau. The Germans intended that this new facility would be able to house over 30,000 people. Again, prisoners were used for the construction, Much of the work was done during the harsh Polish winter. Prisoners were forced to sleep in the barracks as they were built, and because the roof was the last thing to be put on, they had no protection from the merciless weather. Weakened by months of terrible conditions, many did not survive the cold. Exhaustion, hunger, and beatings by the Germans killed several others. The German murder machine was beginning to oil its gears, so in addition to the barracks, 4 gas chambers were built that would be used for a dark purpose. Unlike Auschwitz-Birkenau had been designed primarily as an extermination center and would soon be operational. At the beginning of 1942, Adolf Hitler and the rest of the Nazi leaders began to discuss the best way to consolidate their macabre plan. The time had come to employ the final solution, with which they sought to wipe out the Jewish population housed in the concentration camps. To do so, they would begin using the gas chambers built immediately. Auschwitz, due to its large size and number of people held there, became one of the deadliest centers in the entire Third Reich. As soon as they got off the train, the prisoners were separated into 2 large groups by SS guards. The healthiest looking were shaved, tattooed with an identification number, and sent to the barracks. The weakest, including the elderly, pregnant women, and children, were almost without exception sent to the gas chambers. The smoke rising from the chimneys was a constant reminder to the other prisoners of the fate that awaited them if their performance began to falter.
היה איזה מין מבנה כזה ששומרים עומדים בזה. ושם חיכינו איזה שעה, 2, 3. כמובן, אני מדברת שתמיד המלווים הגרמנים, זה לא... אחרי שעה, 2 אמרו לשבת, אחרי 2 לקום. אחר כך עשינו סיבוב, ועוד פעם שידור חוזר, לשבת, לקום, ועוד פעם, עוד שם. עד שהיה כבר מאוחר בלילה, וחזרנו לבלוק. ואז נתברר שהבלוק הזה היה מועמד להשמדה, אבל התגלגל לקרמטוריום. בשביל זה אני מספרת לכם.
The woman we just heard about was saved from a terrible death, but she had to remain a prisoner in this camp, where life was an endless agony. The barracks where they slept had been designed for 700 prisoners each, but with the constant flow of new captives, they ended up piling up many more, almost twice as many as planned. Some buildings did not even have beds, and there were only straw mattresses where fleas and other pests abounded. Sometimes, even that was missing, and the only option was to sleep on the hard, cold floor. The coal stove was not enough to heat the place. Many died due to these brutal conditions. The prisoners were awakened early by the guards, before the sun came up. Already at 5 in the morning, they had to be up for their breakfast. This consisted of an infusion of herbs or water boiled with grains as a substitute for coffee. It is not known what the origin was, but it was so bitter that many could not stomach it or refused it, even if it was one of the few meals offered. If they were lucky, they might be given a piece of bread. Then the SS men would take them out of the barracks to form lines for roll call. If someone took longer than allowed, or if the count did not add up to the expected number, this procedure could sometimes last for hours. It did not matter if it was raining or snowing. It was another time when the sadistic Germans could torture their prisoners. There were times when some people, so weakened by all their experiences, died during roll call, falling exhausted to the frozen ground. This, far from ending the matter, only made it last even longer. When the Germans were finally satisfied, they ordered them to march to their work detachments. Many worked making war products, such as vehicle parts or weapons. Others were employed by companies such as Bayer, Siemens, and IG Farben to increase their wealth. In fact, Auschwitz III, also called Monowitz, was built by the latter company to create synthetic rubber. This and other companies took advantage of slave labor, paying the Nazi government to employ the prisoners. Many were also used to expand the concentration camp, which always needed to house more captives, or in the coal mines outside the camp. Some women were taken to warehouses where they separated the valuable belongings of the captives, such as clothes and jewelry. Although they were theoretically sold to provide funds to the government, many of these items were appropriated by the guards as gifts for their wives. Workdays could last 11 hours or more. Any mistakes made were often brutally punished by the guards, either by taking away lunch, beating them, or even summarily executing them. The food given consisted of soup with potatoes, grains, and flour. As with breakfast, many vomited it, leaving them weaker for the rest of the day. Hunger was a constant companion for the inhabitants of Auschwitz, and malnutrition killed almost as many as the gas chambers.
Food was brought to us in barrels, wooden barrels. It was a vegetable, heavy, thick vegetable concoction of soup. We were given what you might call a liter of it, one scoop, into a dish, into a bowl. I remember it was a maroon-colored bowl that we always wore. It was hanging from the belt together with a spoon. You didn't dare lose it, because without that you didn't eat.
In a place like this, everyone had to think about their own survival. After the workday was over, the prisoners were escorted back to the barracks. They were tasked with carrying the bodies of those who had died during the day to be burned. Dinner was not much better than lunch, consisting mostly of bread, and sometimes accompanied by a small piece of meat or cheese. By mid-1942, the Germans realized that tens of thousands of prisoners were dying from lack of food and were forced to improve these conditions. This was not due to a humanitarian issue, but merely a practical one. They were running out of sources of forced labor. However, this was not the case for the Jews and the Soviets, who had been marked for total extermination. They continued to suffer extreme hunger until their captivity ended. By the end of 1942, the final solution was in full operation. Many prisoners from other camps were sent to Birkenau to be killed there, as it had numerous gas chambers built for this macabre purpose. When they arrived, to prevent panic, they were told that the rooms they were sent to were for disinfection. But when the doors were closed, the Germans activated the gas, which was a pesticide called Zyklon B. Immediately, people began banging on the walls and begging for mercy, but it was all in vain. Minutes later, the screams stopped, and certain selected prisoners entered to remove the bodies. By 1944, it is estimated that approximately 20,000 people were killed in this way per day. The incinerators often could not cope with the number of corpses, and they piled up, rotting or freezing depending on the time of year. Executions, however, did not only occur in the gas chambers. The guards were given explicit permission to unleash their fury on the prisoners. Any slightest infraction was severely punished, and these tortures often ended in the death of the victim. The prisoners barely reacted when a fellow prisoner was shot in the head, as the Germans had accustomed them to such crimes. Within Auschwitz-Birkenau, Block 11 had been designated solely for punishment. According to reports, having one's hands in one's pockets and daring to ask for a second ration of food were the most common reasons for people being sent there. Within this block, SS men would whip offenders with whips or hang them on metal hooks until they were off the ground. They would even hold their heads inside chimneys, indifferent to their screams of pain. If the prisoner was too weak after his torture, he was sent to the gas chamber without a second thought. Block 10 was another section of Auschwitz designed for sadistic use. This was where German doctors performed their experiments on prisoners who were used as guinea pigs. As well as eliminating those deemed inferior, they also sought to prohibit them from reproducing. Tests were run to find an effective sterilizer. Many women were exposed to high doses of X-rays to test their effect. Many others were injected with dangerous chemicals that would render their wombs incapable of bearing children. Several died in these trials, or were so damaged that they were no longer of any use to the Nazis and were sent straight to the gas chambers. Outside of sterilization, other experiments were also carried out. In Block 10 of Auschwitz, Josef Mengele carried out his dark tests for which he became infamous. Any prisoner with dwarfism or hereditary diseases was sent to a barracks reserved for him, as were the twin brothers. The Nazi scientist was obsessed with these conditions, so he carried out a large number of tests on these people. When he had obtained the information he sought, he would kill them and then dissect them. Tens of thousands entered his laboratory, but only a few survived.
One day I became extremely ill after a visit to the lab, and I was taken to a barrack that was filled with practically living dead.
So there you are, a living dead person, knowing it.
Well, Mengele came in every morning and every evening, twice a day, with 4 other doctors. And he declared, very sarcastically laughing, "Too bad, she's so young. She has only 2 weeks to live."
Right in front of you.
Right in front of me.
Of the 3,000 twins Mengele experimented on, only 150 survived until the camp's liberation. The woman we hear about was one of the lucky few. The Auschwitz chambers continued to operate until October 1944, murdering tens of thousands of people every day. But the Nazis knew they did not have much time left. The Soviet Red Army was rapidly approaching Poland, having put the Germans on the run the previous year. SS guards, anticipating that Hitler would lose the war, did not want any evidence of what had happened in the concentration camp to remain. The chambers and crematoria were demolished, along with many of the barracks and high-ranking officers' offices. All records of arrivals, executions, and torture were destroyed. But hundreds of thousands of prisoners were still alive. Some Germans wanted to kill them, but others still saw them as labor, or even as hostages to negotiate with the Soviets or the rest of the Allies. It was thus decided to transfer the captives into the interior of the Reich, to place them in other concentration camps.
Anybody who couldn't march, couldn't follow, was shot, and the body was thrown on the side of the road.
Some of us were very sick, and we didn't know whether we will make it.
The Nazis did not have vehicles to move such a large number of people, so transport was done on foot. These death marches, as they were later known, took place in winter, with temperatures dipping below 0 degrees. Thousands of weakened prisoners, who had not eaten well for years and were without warm clothing, died on the way due to the merciless cold. Those who fell too far behind were in turn executed by the Nazis. It is believed that of the approximately 60,000 who were there at the start of the march, about 15,000 fell victim to the weather or gunfire. Auschwitz was liberated on January 27, 1945 by the Soviets. When they entered the camp, only 7,000 prisoners were still alive, most too weakened to understand that they had been liberated from the Nazis. More than 1 million people, including Jews, Slavs, Roma, and others, died there. Because of the staggering number of deaths, it is one of the most famous concentration camps and an example of the cruelty to which the Nazi regime reached. But despite the Germans' attempts to denigrate them, many of these captives never lost their humanity. They held meetings to celebrate their religion, culture, and festivities throughout the years of imprisonment. They helped each other, sharing food and other goods, even knowing the fate that would await them if they were discovered by the guards. There were even rebellions, which, despite having failed, showed the unbeatable spirit of these people. We have reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, what impacts you the most about the history of Auschwitz? Leave us your answer in the comments box below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.